The sun was just climbing over the jagged peaks when Hart rode into Dusty Gulch, the spurs on his boots jingling with every step, and the wind carrying the dry, sharp scent of sagebrush. He was a man of few words, the kind that made people nod politely and move along. Knowing trouble followed him like a shadow. Cole's horse, a black stallion with a scar across its left flank, stomped impatiently in the corral outside the Silver Spur Saloon, the only place in town with a whiskey strong enough to wash the dust out of a man's throat, and Cole knew he needed both the horse and the drink to survive what was coming. He was hired to guard the goal, a shipment so large the railroad foreman had been pacing like a rattlesnake in a tin box, whispering about outlaws, rustlers and bandits that had been hovering like vultures on the horizon. Cole had no loyalty to anyone in Dusty Gulch yet, but he had loyalty to one thing: his own skin, and the glint of gold always spoke louder than the wind when it rattled through the canyon. As he tied his horse and entered the saloon, the chatter died down, eyes following the stranger with the dark coat, and weary eyes that seemed to measure everyone in inches and seconds. The gold, they told him, was hidden in a wagon parked behind the livery stable, guarded by a few rough men from the town, and while he had the appearance of a hired hand, Cole knew the kind of work that waited for him. There was tension in the air thick enough to choke a man, the kind that made even the dogs bark at shadows, and Cole had learned a long time ago that tension often led to blood, not coin. His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver as he surveyed the street, his instincts tuned to the faintest twitch of a finger or the glimmer of steel under a coat. That was when he saw her, standing by the hitching post, brushing a lock of chestnut hair from her sunburned face. Her dress was plain, dusty, yet it had a way of catching the light, soft folds that seemed to move like water even in the stiff wind. She smiled at a child chasing a chicken down the street, and for the briefest moment, Cole forgot the gold, the outlaws, the job. The saloon doors banged behind him, and he realized he hadn't taken a single sip of whiskey, the heat in his throat replaced by a hollowness he didn't recognize. Her name was Clara, the daughter of the storekeeper, and she had a laugh that could chase away the ache of a long ride. She was talking to no one in particular, yet every glance seemed to rest on him just long enough to make him feel like a man who had been lost and suddenly remembered where he belonged. Cole wasn't used to soft things, least of all smiles, but there was something about hers that made the hard edges of his life blur for a moment. He told himself it was a distraction, dangerous in a town like this, but his hand itched toward her presence anyway, not the gun. That evening, the foreman introduced him to the men who would accompany him, a ragged crew with sun-leathered faces and eyes that had seen too much. They were skeptical, polite at first, but the air carried suspicion like dust in the canyon. Cole listened to their stories of previous shipments ambushed, their warnings about the Hollow Ridge gang, and nodded without revealing the thoughts he kept behind the dark lines of his jaw. There was gold to guard, yes, but there was also a life to consider, a principle he had long since written in invisible ink across the scars on his hands. That night, as Cole walked back past the dim glow of the saloon lamps, he saw Clara again, sitting on the steps of her father's shop, sketching something in a notebook, her eyes lifted, catching his with a spark that felt like sunlight through a storm. He tipped his hat, unsure why he felt a pull stronger than the lure of gold, stronger than the promise of safety. She waved him over, a gesture innocent enough to seem harmless, but in that small town where every move had weight, it was enough to make a man reconsider every choice he had made that day. Cole returned to the livery stable, the gold wagon looming in the moonlight, wrapped in canvas and locked with iron, but his thoughts were not on the safe transfer, the planned route, or the outlaws who might strike before dawn. They were on the curve of Clara's lips, the warmth in her laugh, the way she could make a man forget the edge of his own shadow. He shook his head, lighting a cigar, smoke curling around him like a promise. He had been hired to guard gold, yes, but perhaps, he thought as he stared into the quiet street, he was about to learn that protecting a smile might be worth more than all the coin in the West. The next morning, the sun burned bright over Dusty Gulch, washing the street in harsh gold, and Hart was already awake, pacing near the livery stable while his horse shifted restlessly under the weight of anticipation. The wagon with the gold sat ready, locked tight and silent, but the silence carried its own threat. Outlaws had a way of smelling fear like wolves, and Cole could almost hear them waiting somewhere beyond the ridge. His eyes swept the horizon, the wind carrying the scent of dry earth and smoke from a distant fire, and in the back of his mind, he wondered if Clara was safe in the shop. the warmth of her smile from the night before still lingering like a ghost he could not shake. Clara had emerged from her father's store, carrying a basket of goods for the morning market, and her presence lit the dusty street like a sudden flare of hope. She greeted Cole with a nod and a small smile, careful, aware of the unspoken dangers in the town. Yet every glance she gave him seemed to anchor him to something that had nothing to do with gold. He tipped his hat as he walked past, but his eyes lingered on her, and for the first time, he realized that guarding gold could not compare to guarding the fragile trust in another person. The foreman appeared then, barking orders about the route to Hollow Ridge, reminders of the men who would ride with Cole, and warnings of the gang that lurked in the hills. The day stretched ahead like a taut rope, and Cole felt the weight of every decision pressing against his chest as the wagon rolled out of town. Cole rode beside it, eyes scanning every shadow, every twist of the canyon. The men with him were competent, but none of them carried the instinct that came from years surviving alone in the West. Cole's hand hovered near his revolver constantly, the sound of wheels on gravel a steady drumbeat in his mind. And yet, despite the tension, thoughts of Clara crept in, her soft voice echoing in his ears. The memory of her laughter made the harsh edges of the trail seem almost bearable, a reminder that even in a land full of greed and danger, something pure could exist. By midday, they reached a narrow pass where the earth dropped sharply on either side, and Cole slowed the wagon, scanning the cliffs above. The hollowed rocks were perfect for ambush, and he could almost imagine the Hollow Ridge gang crouched in shadow, waiting for the perfect moment. One of the men whispered about sightings of masked riders earlier, and Cole merely nodded, the wind whipping dust into their faces. His mind was half on strategy, half on the memory of Clara sitting on the steps of the store, her notebook in hand, drawing shapes he could not see, but shapes that seemed to sketch themselves into his very soul. There was gold to protect, yes, but there was also something he had never considered before, someone worth protecting. The attack came suddenly, a roar of hooves and shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Cole's instincts kicked in, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. The gang descended like shadows, rifles glinting, and the wagon jolted as bullets struck wood and metal. The men he rode with scrambled, some firing, some diving for cover, but Cole moved with precision, every shot calculated, every decision a step between life and death. And yet, even in the chaos, his mind flickered to Clara, imagining her face, imagining her safe and untouched by the violence that roared around him. He shouted orders, covering the wagon, forcing the attackers to retreat up the slope, but the encounter left him shaken, the reminder of how thin the line between safety and disaster could be. Once the gang had vanished, leaving smoke and hoofprints in their wake, Cole dismounted, checking the wagon and the men, none of whom were badly hurt, but all of whom were shaken. The gold was safe, for now, but the encounter had changed something in him, something unspoken and dangerous, a new sense of purpose that had nothing to do with money. He mounted his horse and urged the wagon forward, the ridge behind them echoing with the fading shouts, and he realized that he was no longer just guarding gold. He was guarding something far more fragile, something worth more than silver or coin. The thought of Clara waiting in Dusty Gulch gave him a focus he hadn't known he could feel. That night, they camped under a sky smeared with stars, the fire crackling and sending sparks into the blackness. The men drank quietly, weary from the day's fight, but Cole kept to himself, sharpening a knife and staring into the flames. His mind wandered back to Clara, to the way the sunlight had caught in her hair, to the curve of her lips. He knew he would ride back to her, no matter the gold, no matter the threats waiting along the ridge. There was a new weight on his shoulders, not the burden of wealth, but the responsibility to someone he cared about, someone who had not yet asked for anything and yet demanded everything in the quietest way. By dawn, the ridge behind them lay silent, and the wagon rolled steadily toward Dusty Gulch. But Cole's thoughts were tangled in worry and anticipation. He rode ahead briefly, scanning the path, and allowed himself a moment to imagine Clara smiling as he returned. His hand brushed the revolver, ready for the next attack, but his heart, surprisingly, raced for her. Not the gold. The journey had changed him, the gold no longer the prize he thought it was, and he knew deep down that the fight was not over. Not for the gold, not for the smiles, not for the shadows that lurked behind every canyon, but somewhere in that dust-filled horizon, he had found a reason to fight that had nothing to do with coin, and everything to do with a girl who had made him feel alive again. Dusty Gulch lay ahead like a promise, The town bathed in late afternoon sunlight, but Cole Hart's eyes scanned the horizon with the tension of a man who had been tested and found neither weak nor safe. The Hollow Ridge gang had struck once, and they would strike again. Their hunger for gold matched only by their cruelty. Cole tightened his grip on the reins, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavy on his shoulders, not for the coin, but for Clara, for the fragile hope she had sparked in him. The wagon moved cautiously, the men beside him alert, but Cole's focus was sharpest on the ridges above, the hidden shadows that could erupt into violence at any moment. Clara waited at the edge of the street, her hands busy with the small chores of the store, yet her eyes never left the road. The moment Cole spotted her, his chest tightened with relief, and an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, stronger than any fire he had ever known on a cold night. He tipped his hat, a silent greeting, and she returned the gesture, a subtle curve of her lips that made the tension in his muscles ease for just a heartbeat. But the peace was short, as the sound of galloping hooves echoed from the canyon behind, sharp and sudden, and Cole's instinct screamed that the gang had followed them, hiding until the perfect moment to strike. The attack came swift, a flurry of riders leaping from cover, rifles blazing, and the wagon jolted under the first volley. Cole rolled from his saddle, firing with precise, measured shots. The men around him scrambled, some ducking, some returning fire, and the street of Dusty Gulch became a theater of chaos. Dust kicked up around them, the scent of smoke and gunpowder thick in the air, and Cole's eyes searched for Clara, imagining her in the doorway, vulnerable, waiting. The fight was no longer just about gold. It was about everything he had come to care for, every smile and glance he had stolen in passing moments that now felt like treasures, more precious than the gold he had been hired to guard. Bullets chipped wood and splintered the wagon's frame, but Cole's focus never wavered. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had lived through too many fights to waste a single breath. And then he saw her, stepping back into the shop, pulling the children inside as a shadow passed the doorway. The sight struck him harder than any shot, and he felt a surge of protectiveness, a fire that burned brighter than any fear. He shouted orders to the men, positioning them between the gang and the street, directing the defense like a general who had learned that strategy was more than tactics. It was heart. Every move was measured, deliberate, because lives, not gold, hung in the balance. The battle raged until the sun dipped low, painting the town in shades of fire and blood. Cole's horse reared and dodged debris, bullets clanging off metal, but through the chaos, he kept Clara in his sight, imagining the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes, and it gave him courage he had never known. One by one, the gang's riders fell back, their confidence broken by a man who refused to be intimidated, who had learned that gold was not the prize he sought. It was the quiet moments, the warmth of a life worth protecting, and every shot he fired carried the weight of that realization. By nightfall, silence returned to the streets, broken only by the groan of wounded men and the distant call of a coyote. Dust settled over the town like a shroud, and Cole finally allowed himself to breathe. Knowing he had held what mattered most, Clara emerged from the shop, cautious, yet her steps were steady, and when she looked at him, her eyes reflected relief, and something else, something that made his chest tighten with hope. He dismounted slowly, walking toward her through the debris and dust, his boots crunching over gravel, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile, not for the gold, not for the survival, but for her. The two met in the middle of the street, the chaos around them fading into the background, and she reached out, placing her hand over his, a quiet gesture that spoke louder than any words. Cole felt a weight lift from him, replaced by a new kind of promise, one that had nothing to do with the work he had been hired to do. That night, the townspeople gathered to tend to the wounded and repair what had been broken, and Cole and Clara walked through the aftermath together, speaking little, letting the silence carry the understanding between them. He showed her the wagon, the gold still intact, and she laughed softly, a sound that made him feel like sunlight after a storm. "All that for a smile," she said, teasing, and he could only shrug, realizing she was right. The gold had drawn him to Dusty Gulch, but it was Clara's courage, her presence, her laughter, that had kept him fighting. It was a truth he would carry as long as he drew breath, more valuable than any treasure buried under the sun. By dawn, the town had healed, at least in the ways that mattered, and Cole mounted his horse, ready to leave the ridge behind, but he did not ride away, because Clara had found her way to him, standing firm and fearless, holding onto the reins, as if to anchor him to a life he had thought impossible. "Stay," she whispered, and the simplicity of the word was more powerful than 1,000 coins. Cole looked down at her, the dust and danger of the previous days melting away, and he smiled, tipping his hat in acknowledgement that some jobs changed a man in ways nothing could prepare him for. He had been hired to guard gold, yes, but he had ended up protecting something far more precious, something worth every risk, every shot, every scar, smile that would linger in the west long after the shadows had passed.